The night my husband drove away with his suitcase and a quick kiss on my cheek, I stood at the window and watched his tail lights disappear into the dark like two dying embers. I told myself the hollow feeling in my chest was just the quiet of the house settling around me, the way a home always seems too large when only one person is left inside it. I told myself I was being dramatic, that 3 days was nothing, that married women survived longer separations than this every single day without falling apart at the seams. But then, at 11:47 at night, when the whole neighborhood had gone to sleep and the only sound was the distant bark of someone's dog and the hum of the refrigerator, there was a knock at my front door, not the casual, relaxed knock of a neighbor borrowing sugar, not the confident rap of a delivery driver. This was slow, deliberate, like whoever stood on the other side of that door had been standing there for a long time already, working up the courage to raise their fist. And when I opened it, my heart did something it had never done before in 34 years of living. It cracked clean down the middle, right along a fault line I hadn't even known existed. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the kind of love that shows up uninvited and changes everything, hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who needs to hear a story like this today. And subscribe to Secret Storyline so you never miss a story that makes your heart feel something real. And before we go any further, drop a comment below and tell us, where in the world are you watching this from tonight? Whether you're watching from a warm bed in Texas, or a rainy evening in London, or a quiet afternoon in the Philippines, we want to know you're here with us. Now let's go back to that doorstep, because what happened next changed my life in ways I am still trying to find the right words for. My name is Marlowe Sinclair, and I want to tell you something before I tell you this story. I am not a woman who falls apart easily. I grew up in a house where crying was considered a form of weakness, where my mother ironed her grief into the creases of her blouses and my father packed his feelings into the back of his throat and swallowed them whole. I learned early that the world does not slow down for the soft parts of you, so you either learn to keep them hidden or you learn to live without them entirely. By the time I was 30, I had built myself into something I was quietly proud of. I had a career I loved, working as a freelance translator for 3 different publishing houses, turning French and Italian novels into English words that felt like they had always belonged that way. I had a small garden in the backyard that I tended with the same careful attention I gave everything in my life. I had a marriage that looked, from every reasonable angle, like a good one. His name was Devlin Sinclair. We had met at a mutual friend's dinner party 7 years ago when I was 27 and still carrying some residual belief that love was supposed to feel like electricity. Devlin was not electricity. He was more like a fireplace, steady, warm, reliable, the kind of warmth you leaned into without even realizing you were cold. He was thoughtful in the specific way of someone who had been raised to pay attention. He remembered that I hated cilantro. He always filled my car with gas when he borrowed it and left it fuller than he found it. He never once raised his voice at me, not in 7 years, not during any of the hard months we had lived through together. He was a good man. I want you to understand that, because what I am about to tell you is not a story about a bad man. It is a story about what happens when a good man gets so lost inside his own silence that the people who love him can't find him anymore. The business trips had started about a year and a half before that night. Devlin worked in corporate finance for a company that had offices in 4 cities, and at first the travel was occasional. A week here, a long weekend there. But somewhere in the middle of the second year, something shifted. The trips became longer. The calls became shorter. He would come home looking like a version of himself that had been left out in the rain too long. Slightly faded, slightly warped, no longer quite fitting the shape I had learned to hold in my hands. I asked him about it. He said, work was stressful. I asked him if there was something else. He said no, and he said it in a way that made me feel guilty for asking, so I stopped asking. The night he left for what he told me was a 3-day conference in Atlanta. He kissed me at the door and told me he would call when he landed. He did call, a short call, 8 minutes long, during which he told me the hotel was fine. The dinner had been fine. His colleague Marcus had made a terrible joke that he then did not quite get around to telling me. He said he was tired. He said he'd call tomorrow. He said he loved me in the automatic way people say things they still mean but have forgotten how to perform. And then he hung up, and I sat in our quiet living room with my phone in my lap and the television on but muted and a glass of wine I was not really drinking, and I tried to remember the last time I had felt truly, completely known by my husband. I could not find the memory. That frightened me more than I let myself acknowledge. So when the knock came at 11:47 that night, I almost did not answer it. I had changed into my pajamas hours ago, and I was sitting at my desk pretending to work on a translation I had a deadline for, my fingers moving over the keyboard without real intention, my mind somewhere far away from the Italian novel spread open beside my laptop. The knock startled me so badly that I knocked my wine glass and had to grab it before it fell. I sat very still for a moment, listening. It came again. 3 slow, careful knocks. I wrapped my robe around myself and went to the door, and I looked through the peephole, and what I saw on the other side made something in my body go absolutely still. It was Callum Reed, Devlin's best friend, the man who had been the best man at our wedding, the man whose face I had seen across 100 dinner tables, whose laughter I had heard so many times that I could have picked it out of a crowd. Callum, who had moved to Portland 2 years ago for reasons that were never fully explained, whom Devlin still talked about with a particular mix of affection and something more complicated that I had never found quite the right word for. Callum, who was standing on my front porch at midnight with his eyes red and his jacket soaked from the rain I hadn't even realized had started, holding a small envelope in his hand like it was something fragile, like it was something that might break him if he held it wrong. I opened the door. We stood there for a moment looking at each other, and I saw in the specific quality of his expression the way he couldn't quite decide where to direct his gaze, the way his jaw was working like he was chewing on words he hadn't yet decided to say out loud, that whatever had brought him to my door at this hour was serious in a way that was going to rearrange things. I could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before it arrives, that particular shift in pressure that tells your body Something is coming before your mind has caught up. He said he was sorry to come so late. He said he had been sitting in his car at the end of the street for almost 2 hours trying to decide if he should come to the door at all. He said he had driven 6 hours from Portland to get here, and that he hadn't slept, and that he needed me to read something before he could explain anything else. And then he held out the envelope. I took it. My hands were steadier than I expected them to be. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper, handwritten in ink I recognized immediately as Devlin's, that particular combination of neat letters and hasty loops that I had seen on grocery lists and birthday cards, and the small notes he used to leave on the kitchen counter in the early years of our marriage. The letter was addressed to Callum, not to me, and yet Callum had brought it to me, which meant he had made a decision about what I deserved to know. And that decision was either the most compassionate thing anyone had ever done for me or the most devastating, and I could not yet tell which. I read it standing there in the doorway with the rain falling softly behind Callum's shoulder and the porch light casting everything in that particular shade of amber that makes ordinary moments look like they belong in a film. I read it twice. The second time, more slowly, because the first time my brain had moved too fast, skimming across the surface of the words without letting them sink all the way in. By the time I finished reading it the second time, I had lowered myself onto the porch step without fully realizing I had moved, and Callum was sitting beside me, not touching me, not saying anything, just being present in the way that certain people know how to be when they understand that presence is sometimes the only thing that helps. The letter was not what I expected. I think I had braced myself for a confession of infidelity. I think some part of me had been half preparing for that particular blow for months, the way you sometimes press on a bruise just to confirm it's there. But the letter was not that. It was something harder to hold and in some ways harder to forgive than infidelity, because it was the truth, the whole, undefended, finally spoken truth about what had been happening to my husband for the past 2 years, about where he had actually been going on some of those trips, about why he had come home looking like a man being slowly unmade by something he couldn't name. Devlin had been struggling with depression, not the mild, manageable kind that productivity articles talk about in careful, hopeful language. The deep, erosive kind that doesn't announce itself dramatically, but instead works quietly, the way water works on stone, wearing down what was solid until the shape of a person is fundamentally altered and they look in the mirror and no longer fully recognize what they see. He had first felt it, he wrote, about 18 months ago. He had tried to manage it alone because he was Devlin, and managing things alone was what Devlin did. He had not told me because, and this was the part of the letter that I had to read 3 times before I stopped feeling like something was sitting on my chest. He had not told me because he was afraid of losing the version of himself I had married. He was afraid that if I saw the real shape of what was happening to him, I would grieve the man I had loved before, and he could not bear to watch me do that. He thought he was protecting me. He thought he was protecting us. He had not understood, not yet, that the silence he thought was a shield was actually a wall. and that I had been standing on the other side of it alone for a very long time, wondering why the distance between us kept growing without my understanding of what I had done to cause it. He had not gone to Atlanta. He was in a treatment facility in Vermont. He had checked himself in 4 days ago. He had asked Callum, the only person he had told the full truth to wait 3 days before telling me, because he needed 3 days to begin to feel like he was not going to collapse under the weight of having finally admitted that he needed help. The letter was written the day he checked in. He had given it to Callum with instructions to deliver it only if Callum felt that the time was right, and Callum, sitting in his car at the end of my street for 2 hours in the rain, had decided that tonight was the time. I sat on that porch step for a long time. The rain was soft and not unpleasant. Callum sat beside me, and at some point he had taken off his jacket and draped it over my shoulders without making a thing of it, and I was wearing it without making a thing of it either, which felt like exactly the right way to handle that moment. Neither of us spoke for what might have been 10 minutes. The neighborhood slept around us. Somewhere far away, a car alarm started and stopped. The dog that had been barking had gone quiet. What I felt during those 10 minutes was not a simple emotion. It was a layered thing, the way geological formations are layered, each stratum belonging to a different era. There was grief in there, real grief, for the 1.5 years of distance that now had a name and an explanation, but was still a 1.5 years of my life that I had spent feeling unseen and slowly loosening my hold on a marriage I had believed in. There was anger too, the clean, legitimate kind that comes from having been excluded from something that affected you profoundly, from having been treated as someone who needed protection rather than as a partner who deserved the truth. And underneath all of that, underneath the grief and the anger, there was something else that I recognized, even though I had not expected to find it there. There was relief, the terrible, complicated relief of finally knowing, of having the shape of the thing in my hands after spending so long reaching around in the dark for it. Callum finally spoke. He said he was sorry he hadn't told me sooner. He said he had been in an impossible position, that Devlin was his closest friend and he had made a promise, but that he had also spent 2 years watching me at dinners and gatherings and occasional Sunday afternoons at our house, watching me work very hard to be fine, and it had cost him something. He said the drive from Portland had given him a lot of time to think about the difference between loyalty and complicity, and that he had come to believe they were not the same thing, and that real loyalty to someone sometimes meant doing the thing that would temporarily hurt them in the service of something that might actually help. I told him he was right. I meant it without reservation. What happened over the next several hours on that porch was something I would later describe to my therapist as one of the most unexpectedly important conversations of my adult life. Callum and I talked about Devlin, yes, about who he had been when they were young men in their 20s, about the particular architecture of his pride, about the way he had been raised by a father who wore his emotional restraint like armor and had passed it on to his son, the way fathers pass on their best and worst qualities without ever intending to do either. But we also talked about other things, about what it costs a person to maintain silence over a long period, about the particular loneliness of being in a marriage where the person across from you is physically present but emotionally somewhere else, about the strange experience of loving someone and simultaneously grieving them, the way Callum had been grieving his friend and I had been grieving my husband separately without knowing we were doing the same thing. He told me about his own life, the life he had built in Portland after leaving the city, which had more grief in it than his easy smile at dinner parties had ever suggested. He had gone through a divorce 3 years ago that had taken something from him he was still in the process of figuring out how to recover. He had moved to Portland partly for a job, and partly because he needed to put distance between himself and the version of his life that had failed, to give himself enough room to become something other than a man standing in the rubble of a marriage and not knowing how to start clearing it away. The rain stopped somewhere around 2 in the morning. By 3, we had moved inside because the night air had gotten cold in the way autumn nights in our neighborhood do, dropping 20 degrees once the rain clears. I made tea, which is my automatic response to any situation that requires me to do something with my hands, and Callum sat at my kitchen table and told me more about the facility in Vermont, about what he knew of the treatment program, about the fact that Devlin had, in his last message to Callum, sent from the facility's shared phone, sounded like a man who was exhausted, but also, for the first time in a long time, something approaching relieved. I sat across from him at my own kitchen table, in my own house, with my husband 3 states away, in a place I hadn't known existed until 2 hours ago, and I tried to understand what I was going to do next. Not in the logistical sense. That part was actually relatively clear. I would call the facility in the morning. I would figure out how to get to Vermont. I would show up because showing up was what you did for the person you had promised to love in exactly the circumstances they were most afraid to let you see. But in the deeper sense, in the sense of who I was going to be on the other side of this night, what I was going to do with the anger and the grief and the relief, how I was going to hold all of those things at once and still be someone capable of walking into a treatment facility and sitting across from my husband and being what he needed me to be. Callum looked at me at one point across the kitchen table and said something I have thought about many times since. He said that one of the things he had noticed about me over the years, one of the things Devlin talked about when he talked about me, was that I had a particular kind of steadiness that was different from toughness. He said toughness was about not being affected by things, but steadiness was about being fully affected and continuing anyway, and that there was a grace in that second kind that the first kind could never quite achieve. He said he thought I was going to be okay. Not in the dismissive way people say that to make themselves feel better. In the specific, measured way of someone who has looked at the evidence and arrived at a conclusion. I didn't say anything. I just wrapped my hands around my teacup and let the warmth of it move through my palms. Outside, the neighborhood was beginning to lighten at the edges, the way it does in the last hour before dawn when the sky shifts from black to that particular shade of blue-gray that promises but does not yet deliver morning. I had been awake for 21 hours. I felt it in the specific heaviness behind my eyes, in the way the edges of the room had taken on a slightly soft quality. And yet I also felt, underneath all of that exhaustion, a strange and delicate clarity, the kind that sometimes comes after a long, hard rain when everything is clean and visible, and the air has that particular sharpness that makes you feel like you can see farther than usual. I called the facility in Vermont at 9 the next morning. The woman who answered was professional and warm in the careful, calibrated way of someone trained to manage the emotions of frightened family members. And she told me what she could tell me, which was not everything but was enough. She told me that Devlin had listed me as his primary contact, but had asked for a few more days before any calls were made. She told me that this was not uncommon, that patients in the early stages of treatment often needed a brief period to build enough stability before they could hold a conversation with the people whose opinions mattered most to them. She told me I could write him a letter if I wanted to, that letters were welcome, and that she would make sure he received it. I wrote him a letter that afternoon. Callum had stayed the night, sleeping in the guest room because it had been 3 in the morning by the time we had finished talking, and he was in no condition to drive anywhere. And he had gone out in the morning and come back with coffee and the particular kind of pastries from the bakery 2 blocks away that I had once mentioned were my favorite, which meant Devlin had told him at some point. And the smallness of that detail, the fact that my husband had shared that small knowledge about me with his best friend, undid me a little in a way that the larger facts hadn't quite managed. The letter I wrote to Devlin took me 4 hours to write, not because I didn't know what I wanted to say, but because I had spent so many years keeping the soft parts of myself contained that putting them into words on paper felt like trying to pour water through my fingers. The moment I found one true thing, another 3 spilled out before I could catch them. I wrote about the grief I had carried for the past 18 months, but I also wrote about the grief I now understood he had been carrying alone without telling me, and how I wished with everything in me that he had felt safe enough to share it. I wrote about the anger because I believed he deserved the truth of it. But I also wrote about where the anger came from, which was not from what he had done, but from how much I loved him and how much his absence, the real interior absence of him, had cost me. And then I wrote about something I had not expected to write about, which was hope. Real hope. Not the performed kind that you paste over fear, but the actual article, the kind that knows the full weight of what it's asking you to carry and chooses to carry it anyway. I told him I was not going anywhere. I told him that what he had done in checking himself into that facility was one of the bravest things I had ever known him to do, and that I had always known he was capable of that kind of courage, even when he couldn't see it in himself. I told him that the version of himself he was afraid of me seeing was not going to change how I saw him. I told him that I had married the whole person, not the polished surface of him, and that the deep and struggling parts of him were not separate from the man I loved. They were part of the man I loved. They were, in some ways, the truest parts of him, the parts that had been trying for years to tell us both something we needed to hear. I folded the letter and put it in an envelope and gave it to Callum to mail because I couldn't quite make myself walk to the mailbox alone with it. And he took it without comment and came back 20 minutes later and told me it was done. And I nodded and went into the kitchen and started making lunch for us both, because that was what I needed to do right then, to have a task, to have my hands occupied, to move through the ordinary motions of feeding people while the extraordinary weight of everything else settled into the structure of the day. Callum stayed for 3 days, not because I asked him to, but because he offered and I said yes, which was itself a small departure from my usual way of managing things. He was easy to have in the house. He did not require entertaining. He was the kind of person who could sit in a room with you and read while you worked, and the silence between you felt companionable rather than awkward. He cooked twice, both times producing things from my refrigerator that I would not have thought to combine, and both times they were unexpectedly good. He fixed the back gate that had been sticking for 6 months because Devlin had kept meaning to get to it, and somehow never had. He did these things without making a production of them, which is the only way to do kind things without making them feel like charity. On the second evening, we sat in the garden after dinner, in the chairs I kept out there year-round, even in months when they went unused, and the garden was doing the particular thing it does in early autumn when the light hits it at a low angle and every leaf has its own shadow. I had been thinking all day about something Callum had said the night before about the difference between loyalty and complicity, and I found myself saying out loud that I thought there was a similar distinction to be made between love and self-erasure, that I had spent 1.5 years making myself smaller and quieter and less demanding in the belief that I was loving my husband through something, when in fact what I had been doing was disappearing slowly, the way things disappear when they are not seen, not dramatically, not all at once, but in small increments that you only notice in aggregate, when you finally look in the mirror and are surprised by who is looking back. Callum listened the way he listened to everything, which was completely without the restless energy of someone waiting for their turn to speak. When I had finished, he said that he thought both things I had said were true, that I had been trying to love Devlin, and that the method I had chosen had cost me something important, and that those two things could coexist without either of them canceling the other out. He said that the work going forward for both of us would be figuring out how to be in the same room as each other's pain without automatically moving to make it smaller, because the impulse to protect the people we love from their own darkness was natural and even kind, but it was also, in certain configurations, a form of abandonment, that the deepest form of staying with someone was staying with them inside the truth of what they were experiencing, not managing it from a careful distance. I thought about my mother ironing her grief into her blouses. I thought about my father swallowing his. I thought about the whole long inheritance of that particular way of being in the world, the way it had shaped me without my consent or awareness, the way I had arrived at adulthood already equipped with the belief that feelings were problems to be managed rather than information to be received. I thought about Devlin, who had been raised by his own version of that same inheritance, who had internalized it so completely that by the time he was drowning in it, he couldn't even tell the people who loved him what was happening, because to do so would have been to violate the deepest rule he had been taught, which was that you handled things yourself or you didn't deserve to be handling them at all. I thought about how many people were living inside that particular prison, the one built not from cruelty, but from the accumulated silences of people who loved each other and had never learned to say so in the full, unedited, undefended way that actually reaches another person. On the fourth day after that knock at the door, Devlin called. I was in the kitchen when my phone rang, and I saw his name on the screen, still in my phone as Dev, the way it had been since the beginning, before last names felt necessary, and my hand shook a little as I answered it. His voice was different from the way it had been in our last several calls, not dramatically, not all at once, but different in the specific way of something that has been compressed for a long time and has been given a little room to breathe. He sounded slower, more careful, like a man who has learned in the last few days to take up a little more space with his words, to let them land instead of rushing past them. He said he was sorry. He said it 3 different ways over the course of the call, each one more specifically articulated than the last, because Devlin had always been better at precision than at volume, and when he finally decided to say a thing, he said it thoroughly. He said he was sorry for the distance. He said he was sorry for not trusting me with the truth of what was happening to him. He said he was sorry for the 1.5 years of managed smiles and short phone calls and coming home looking like a man who was trying very hard to appear as though nothing was wrong, because he understood now that what he had thought was protecting me had actually been a form of loneliness that he had imposed on both of us, and that was not love, even if it had felt, from the inside, like the most loving thing he knew how to do. I did not tell him it was fine, because it wasn't entirely fine, and I had made a private decision sometime in the last 4 days to stop saying things were fine when they weren't. I told him instead that I had heard him. I told him that I understood the logic of what he had done, even if the logic had been wrong. I told him that I was angry and that I was also, somewhere underneath the anger, more relieved than I had words for, because at least now I knew the shape of what we were dealing with, and a known thing, however hard, was always easier to carry than the thing you couldn't name. I told him I had written him a letter and that he should read it when he was ready and that he didn't need to respond right away, that I was not going anywhere, and that when he was ready to have me come to Vermont, I would be in my car before he finished the sentence. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice that was rough in the way voices are when feelings are pressing against the inside of them from all directions, that he loved me. He said it slowly. He said it like someone who had been away from the language of their own heart for so long that they were relearning it in real time, finding the words in their mouth like something half forgotten, and tasting them carefully to make sure they were still true. They were still true. I could hear that they were. I told him I loved him back, and I meant it with the same complexity and the same steadiness and the same long-practiced refusal to let the hard things undo the real things. Callum left that afternoon after I had told him about the call. He stood at the door with his keys in his hand and looked at me with the particular expression of someone who has been through something significant with another person and is working out what it means now that the acute part is over. I thanked him for coming. I thanked him for making the decision he had made, for driving 6 hours in the rain, for sitting on the porch step, for the pastries and the gate and the evenings in the garden, and the conversation that had given me the language for things I had been trying to describe to myself for months without quite finding the right words. He said that he hadn't done anything extraordinary, just what seemed right. I told him that was wrong, that doing what seemed right in the specific circumstances he had found himself in had required a kind of moral clarity that was rarer than he seemed to think, and that I hoped he knew that. He drove away in the late afternoon light, and I stood at the window and watched his car until it turned the corner. And this time the watching did not have the same hollow feeling in it that my watching of Devlin's taillights had had. This time the watching had something warm and clean in it, the feeling of having been seen and having allowed it, of having let someone into the house and the conversation and the garden and the quiet mornings, and having been better for it rather than diminished by it. I drove to Vermont 8 days later. The facility was exactly what I had imagined in some ways, and nothing like it in others. It was on 40 acres of land in a valley that in mid-October was doing the particular New England thing of making every tree look like it was on fire from the inside, orange and yellow and red against a sky so blue it looked like it had been placed there on purpose. The building itself was modest and clean, the kind of place that has been designed to feel like a pause rather than an institution. There were people walking on the grounds when I arrived, some alone, some in pairs, moving at the deliberate pace of people who have been given permission to slow down. They brought Devlin to a small room with 2 chairs and a window that looked out at the valley. He was thinner than the last time I had seen him. His eyes were different, not sad exactly, or not only that, but open in a way they had not been for a long time, as though something that had been held very tightly behind them had finally been carefully, deliberately unclenched. He stood when I came in, and for a moment we just looked at each other, taking inventory, the way you do after any significant separation, checking to see what has changed and what remains. Then I crossed the room, and he held me for a long time. Neither of us said anything. The room was very quiet. Out the window, the valley burned with October color, indifferent and beautiful, doing what it did every year, regardless of what any of the people inside the building were working through, which was, I understood, part of the point. The world did not rearrange itself for grief or recovery or love. It simply continued, and the continuing was its own kind of instruction. Here is how you do it. Just keep going. Just keep going, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Keep going. We sat in those 2 chairs and we talked for 4 hours. It was the longest real conversation we had had in 2 years, and it was not easy, and it was not comfortable, and there were moments where the honesty of it pressed against me like something I wasn't sure I could hold. But I held it, and he held it. And when we had said all the things that needed to be said on that particular afternoon, not all the things that would ever need to be said, because we were going to need months and probably years of conversations to work through everything that the silence of the last 2 years had accumulated. We sat for a while in the particular piece of people who have survived something together and are still inexplicably there. He told me he had read my letter 3 times. He told me the part about the whole person, about marrying all of him and not just the polished surface, had stayed with him in a way he hadn't been able to articulate even to his therapist, because he had spent so long being afraid of the parts of himself that he didn't know how to manage, that he had forgotten, somewhere in the middle of that fear, that those parts were not separate from him, but were him, and that the people who truly loved him had signed up for the whole of it without knowing they were doing so, which was what love actually was when you stripped away everything that was performance and fear. I told him I was going to need him to be honest with me going forward in a way he hadn't been, and that I understood this was hard for him, but that I was telling him now, with full clarity, that the cost of protecting me from his truth was too high for both of us, and that I would rather carry the hard things with him than stand on the other side of a wall he had built in my name. He said he understood. He said he was working on it. He said the therapist here had told him something in the first week that had shifted something significant in him, which was that vulnerability was not the absence of strength, but its most evolved expression, and that it had taken him until he was 35 years old to even begin to understand what that actually meant in practice. I drove home 2 days later, knowing that nothing was fixed and everything had changed, which is sometimes exactly the right place to find yourself. Devlin came home from Vermont 6 weeks after he had checked himself in. He walked in the front door on a Tuesday afternoon in November with his suitcase and a slightly different quality to the way he moved through the world, not unrecognizable but subtly rearranged, as though the furniture of himself had been moved just slightly during his absence, and he was still in the process of relearning the geography. He put his suitcase down in the hallway, and he stood in the kitchen, and he looked at the garden through the back window for a long moment, and then he said that it looked beautiful even in November, and I said I had been taking care of it, and he said he knew, and we stood together at the back window looking at the garden, and I thought that this was what the long middle of a life looked like, not the dramatic beginning or the story-worthy crisis, but this, 2 people standing at a window after a hard season, still there, still looking at the same view. We are still in couples therapy. Devlin continues his individual work with a therapist he found near home. Some weeks are easier than others. There are days when the old patterns surface, when he gets quiet in the particular way that used to make me feel shut out, and I have to remind myself that I have learned to name the thing now, learned to say gently and without accusation, "I notice you've gotten quiet. Can you tell me what's happening?" And he has learned, slowly, imperfectly, the way all real learning happens, to answer honestly instead of retreating further into the silence. Callum visited in December. He sat across from Devlin at our kitchen table, and I watched the 2 of them together and understood something about friendship that I hadn't had the language for before. That deepest friendships are not the ones that require nothing of us, but the ones that ask us at the crucial moments to choose between comfort and care, and choose care. Devlin thanked him across that table, quietly and without ceremony, and Callum said nothing because he didn't need to, and the three of us had dinner, and the conversation was easy in the way. Conversation is easy when people have been through the real thing together and are still, against the odds, gathered around the same table. I think about that night often. The knock at the door, the rain, the envelope, the porch step, the long hours of conversation that took me somewhere I hadn't known I needed to go. I think about how close I came to not answering the door, how close everything came to continuing in the direction it was heading. Both of us managing our separate silences, both of us becoming more and more carefully alone inside a marriage that still looked, from the outside, like a good one. I think about how fragile the whole thing was, how contingent on one person's decision to drive 6 hours in the rain and sit in a car for 2 hours and finally raise his fist and knock. I don't believe the world is arranged so that the right person always shows up at the right time. I have lived long enough to know that sometimes the hard thing happens and no one comes to the door, and you are left to find your way through it alone. But I also know now, in a way I could not have articulated before that Tuesday night in October, that sometimes someone does show up, that sometimes love, in its many different shapes, drives 6 hours in the rain and brings you the truth you needed and stays on the porch step beside you while you figure out what to do with it. And that, when that happens, when someone offers you that particular gift, the only right thing, the only truly alive thing, is to open the door. My garden is full again in spring. Devlin planted the new rose bed himself, in the corner where nothing had ever grown well. And something about the quality of his attention when he tends it, the way he looks at the new growth, careful and present and genuinely moved, tells me something that no conversation has quite managed to say. He is still learning to be in his own life without flinching from the hard parts. So am I. We are learning it together now, which makes it, if not easier, at least possible, which is, I have come to believe, all any of us can really ask for. If this story reached something inside you, if it made you think of someone you love who has been quiet for too long, or reminded you of a time when someone showed up at exactly the right moment, or made you feel a little less alone in whatever you are carrying right now, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Today, leave a comment and tell us which part of this story stayed with you. Your comments mean more than you know. They tell us that these stories are finding the people who need them. Subscribe to Secret Storyline so you never miss a story that is made to make you feel something real. And before this story closes, drop one word in the comments that describes how this story made you feel. Just one word. We read every single one. To everyone who has ever stood at a window, watching taillights disappear and wondered when the distance started, the door is still there. And sometimes, when the time is right, someone who loves you will come and knock on it. And the bravest thing you will ever do is open it.